Hi, this is Donna Marie, and before we get started, please subscribe to the Best Life of Wellbeing Podcasts. Like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification button so you know when new episodes are dropping. Welcome to the Best Life of Wellbeing video podcast. Dr. Alauna Curry is here with us today, and we're continuing our series, The Art of Letting Go, Decluttering, Purging, Sorting, Clearing, and Releasing. Dr. Alauna is America's only trauma psychiatrist focused exclusively on educating people about the impact of psychological trauma on our mental health from a brain, body, and behavioral perspective. In 2018, she founded the Dr. Alauna Trauma Recovery Institute, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating psychological trauma worldwide by providing affordable public education and professional training in empathy skills practice for traumatized humans, which we all are, right? Traumatized humans.
Lord, yes, Lord.
So I want to just say welcome, Dr. Alauna. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and I'm so excited to talk about the art of letting go. And so welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an important topic and, much needed information and absolutely a conversation we need to have. So thank you for having me.
So would you share just a little bit more about yourself and about your trauma recovery institute?
Sure. So I am Dr. Alauna. I practiced medicine for about 12 years doing psychiatry, mainly working at the VA with veterans and really specializing in PTSD, trauma, stress, and anxiety related conditions. And over those many years, I had a wonderful career. I probably learned as much from the veterans as they learned from me. But ultimately, what I learned in that role was that we're all traumatized and that we have a dysfunctional definition of trauma. Most people think that in order to be traumatized, it has to be big, huge things like, an earthquake and that makes your entire city or country fall apart. And that's, or go to war or something extreme, be the victim of a crime. However, there are many, many things that are psychologically traumatizing, from climate disasters to racism, sexism, gender-based violence, gun violence, COVID. There are just so many things. And I think years ago, I used to shout, trauma is everywhere. And people are like, no, that's not true. It's just, you just seeing it everywhere. Now people are like, oh, okay, I understand what she's saying. Trauma is not just those huge things. There are lots of things, small micro traumas that are constantly happening to us. And the good news is that it affects the same parts of our brain. So my role now, because I am no longer in clinical medicine, I teach and I train people to understand the primitive brain systems that are predictably programmed by trauma. And I give them tools to help them reorient their own mindset and thought process so that they can immediately be able to make different choices and have better control over the outcomes they create. So that's actually where I created that Trauma Recovery Institute. That's my nonprofit organization, which has a mission to educate people about trauma. I have an online portal called the Trauma Recovery Academy, where I've put great, entertaining, educational coursework about the brain, the body, and how it affects your behavior, so that whenever a person is ready to learn more about that, they have a space that they can go.
And I highly recommend that space. Just the benefits in my life from listening to learning about the primitive brain and going through your podcast and listening to your amazing podcast, and how that has helped. It's opened my eyes. It's helped me to see some blind spots, and it helped me to not be so judgmental. You talk a lot about empathy skills, so it helped me with empathy for my own self, right? And so I highly recommend the courses. And I think your Trauma Recovery Institute is great, which is why I wanted you to speak to the audience today.
I remember some years ago. This journey for me started around 2016, 2015. No, actually before that, 2014. Michael Brown Jr. Was a young man that you may be familiar with that was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. And I grew up in St. Louis. That was my stomping grounds.
Mm.
So I was very familiar with the mindset that Michael may have been in. But I also was married to a police officer at that time. So I had a lot of experience and exposure to law enforcement and the extraordinarily difficult job that they have to do. And so the entire situation put me in a space of forced empathy, where, empathy being taking the perspective of another outside of that of which your own brain and body can show you. And when I did that, I understood how divergent our perspectives, our experiences of each other can be, right? Even when we're sitting in the same space right in front of each other,
Yeah.
we're referencing different thoughts, we're interpreting things differently. Human communication is just full of misinterpretations. And that actually led me on the exploration of, pardon my language, but WTF, like what's wrong with humans?
Right.
Like if this is the best that we have and I'm doing the best and operating in the highest spheres of psychiatry and medicine and mental health, then obviously there's some information missing. We something must must be missing because what we're doing is not working. We're throwing more and more strategies and medications and other things at people. And you could see even back in I could see even in 2014, 2015, that we were, as a society, as a human race, on a very divergent course of how we were thinking. And it made me start to want to understand, like, why are we like this?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's wrong with us?
As you were talking, when you mentioned empathy in you defined it a bit, really putting yourself in the shoes of another and understanding another person's point of view and experience. And I said empathy for myself. And
Mm-hmm.
is that possible? Like, so what I was thinking is my younger self. It's like I didn't understand her, and now I understand her. I have empathy
Absolutely.
for her. She's me and I am her, and she
She's
took
doing
care
the
of
best she
me.
knew how. Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely. And it really, empathy for self is really the core mechanism that leads to the healing, right? However, it's also important to have empathy for others because it gives you perspective that helps you have your own healthy mind, right?
Yes.
Because first of all, we're not taught enough about these concepts. Even the concept of empathy, many people will hear that word and a bunch of different definitions and concepts of what it means to be empathetic or an empath or what have you come to mind. And for many people, that's not something they want to be. They're like, empathy, like, how do I empathize with people who are actively oppressing me?
Right.
Or how do I
Right.
empathize with myself when I feel guilty about what I did? And according to my belief systems, I should never be allowed to be happy ever again, right?
Right.
So there are so many different challenges. And quite frankly, the way that our world is set up, it grossly lacks empathy and a deeper understanding of why people make the decisions that they do. And so when it comes to learning to empathize, it's us trying to relearn something that's biologically in us, but that is trained out of us from birth.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
unfortunately, as we grow up and we learn the rules of society, they teach us to be disconnected. They teach us to interpret each other as being so different and so foreign and not having feelings or ignoring our emotions or not speaking about them, avoiding them, or even believing that we don't have them or that they're
Right.
bad or they come from your gut or they come from your heart. And there's so many, myth information. That's what I call it, myth information. Because when you are taught to believe that how you feel is because of something that other people are doing, or like I'm uh, I'm doing this because of what the other person is doing, or, the devil is tempting me, or God made me do it, or whatever, stories that you've learned to tell yourself about your behaviors, it removes your own accountability and it removes your power. So when people are taught that their emotions come from their brain, which is where it actually comes from, and that all your decisions are made with your brain, nowhere else. It's your brain takes into account sensations and input from other parts of your body for sure, but all of your choices, your words, your actions, your facial expressions, this whole thing is
Yes.
controlled by this brain. Point blank, period. And that means that short of some, outside hand or something, some puppeteer strings that you can't see, right? That means
Yes.
that we have to really start paying attention to our thoughts, our words, our beliefs, because that's what's creating the juice in here that we then justify our actions and outcomes.
Yes. So empathy and apathy. So you said the empathy starts with ourselves, but how do you get to empathy? How do you get to empathy if you don't really have that self concern and you're not really connected to what's happening? You're desensitized and you're just like, whatever. How do you
Yeah,
get from there to caring about somebody else's experience?
sure. Well, I would venture to say that apathy has gotten us where we are. Apathy meaning lack of caring, lack of connection, lack of awareness, just like, oh, okay, wars on the other side of the earth,
Right, right.
hmm, you know, okay, fine. And because we think in so much division, we assume that things that affect those people over there don't affect us, right? It's the assumption that the human race is somehow separated, or that we're all these individual little beings. And we are, right? But part of also healing our mindset is understanding that while we are individual, we are also in inextricably connected,
Yes.
meaning that even though you don't know that person, they're a complete stranger to you. They may be on the other side of the earth, because we are all a little speck of dust in the universe, right?
Yeah. Right.
floating, floating around on this huge spaceship that's turning and circling the earth. And the sun is zooming in circles around the solar system and the Milky Way. So we are but dust. However, for our individual experiences, we're everything, right? We are
Right.
so big internally in terms of what our body and our brain experiences in our everyday life. So it's being able to appreciate the reality that we are connected, so we need to care. Now, is it easy to care? No. And actually, it's when the people who have done my program, they're like, this is hard. Like, I'm not asking you to do anything easy, because if it was easy, we'd have done this millions of years ago, at
Right.
least a few thousand, right? It takes knowing what's happening and having the awareness of it. And that's the first step.
Yes.
So humans are like toddlers when it comes to understanding our own body and brain, because of how poorly we've been educated about it. Like, we are I liken it to, we're advanced technology, like we are the most advanced technology on earth, but we know all this external technology like computers and phones and video games and media, television, and we're also captivated in that. However, this technology, this body technology, this brain and this spirit that's all bottled up in each one of us, is the most advanced technology on earth.
Yeah.
So how many years have we been studying humans and studying ourselves, and we're still, even with thousands and millions of intelligent brains, billions over these years, trying to figure out what it is to be human. Here we are, still confused, still figuring it out, right? So we can forgive ourselves, especially when we've never been taught, like, oh, basic stuff like, hey, your brain creates your emotions based on what you are interpreting and telling yourself about the data that it's taking in through your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, skin, etc. And it's making calculations and kicking out interpretations that are distorted based on how your brain is designed. And you have to sort through that because what you think about something may not actually be the truth.
Right.
Wouldn't it be great if we all knew that?
Yeah, humans are like toddlers. One of the comments, I had a conversation with two home organizers, and they gave great tips on, how to keep your house in order, how to create systems and behaviors. But they also mentioned that they both learned as children from a grandparent, a parent, how to create systems so that they could create order in their spaces. And it just kind of stuck with them. And one of the things basically is like what you're saying, with apathy and empathy, it's a learned behavior. You have to understand your brain, how it works. And then it isn't easy to unlearn what you've been learning all of your life. And that was the same thing for them. They learned how to compartmentalize, how to create a space for everything. And they have maintained that. For an adult like me or someone who's interested in organizing their space, you got to learn some systems. You got to unlearn the practices that you have put in place. You got to see yourself.
Yeah.
They also made it clear that they had to work with the individual to understand their style. If they're organizing a pantry, I need to know what items are you reaching for first usually. I need to understand your brain and how it works before I can help you to get these systems in place. And so just to start the conversation a little bit about art of letting go, the topic, some of the questions I asked the home organizers: why do you think it's hard for people to declutter? Do you think people purposefully avoid dealing with their stuff? Do you think releasing clutter helps to free us mentally? And obviously they weren't mental health professionals. They had answered some of these questions. They did a very, very good job. They just talked about learning new skills and behaviors, which is what this is also all about, learning new skills and behaviors. So I'm going to ask you that question. Why do you think it's hard for people to deal with their clutter and avoid dealing with their stuff?
Well, I think of all things in terms of brain systems and programming. So our current society is very emotionally incompetent, and we have a tendency, there's nothing that the human brain and body likes less than pain. And so we avoid painful things like the plague. Once you touch a hot stove, you know it's hot. You're like, ooh, that burnt. And so hot memories, hot experiences, things that have been extremely painful are the things that we most want to avoid again in the future. And our brain becomes programmed to play out patterns and help us reproduce behaviors that we find helpful for survival. So I think first of all that human beings, anytime we're doing a behavior, it's because of programming. And anytime you want to fix that behavior, you have to examine yourself. You can't fix a problem that you haven't identified. So I'm the kind of person I like to go all the way to the end goal and then work my way backwards, right? So in order to be healthy, happy, healed, and in a good space in terms of trauma, you have to be willing to look back on your life and see those traumatic experiences and think back through them and reprocess them with information in mind, information about how your brain processed information, about how we reflect and soak up the information from our environment. And so much of our current language and vocabulary is insufficient to help us understand our own behaviors, that it really starts there, developing the ability to actually explain and describe these challenges with reality-based language and not fantasy type of or a language that doesn't really describe what's happening, right? Many of us have been brought up in households where if somebody's doing something, they acting crazy, or they're touched in the head, or you know, oh, the devil is tempting me to eat this food, or slap you or whatever, right? Or you made me do it. Those type of thought processes are programming basically. So when you spoke earlier about a skill set, most of us we don't think about it like this, but things that we're good at are usually skill sets that have been introduced to us by some way in our life. I know people who are very good at cleaning and being tidy, but they also had really strict grandparents, really strict parents, or somebody who was in their life like at threat of death. You're not gonna have dust on this
Right,
on this
right.
windowsill, right? I had a great grandparent that used to have us cleaning baseboards down there on hands and knees like this, right? So, you
Yes.
know, there are skill skill sets that we learn and that we absorb from our environment and how whoever raised us, whoever we looked up to, and those skill sets are what we are often using in adulthood. And sometimes they didn't give us the tool, or there might be someone who had that skill set, but we didn't absorb that.
Right.
Different people have different ways that they develop. But at the end of the day, it's always about learning how to reprogram your brain into a different behavior pattern. And that to me goes back to the brain reward system, our addiction system, that's fueled by a chemical called dopamine, which is a very powerful chemical, but it goes away fast. So the human body and brain is constantly looking for more dopamine. So whether we get it from our screens or from each other, our interactions, our conversations, and often we get dopamine from judging each other,
Mm,
or having,
oh, yes.
repeating trauma drama, repeating cycles and things that, you can get dopamine from fighting and arguing and having that little mini roller coaster inside of yourself. So that really is actually because we don't understand our biology. I think many of our behavior patterns are about us being able to break out of addiction behaviors and be able to make shifts into new ways of doing things and replacing that dopamine with something, a healthier habit to be addicted to, if you will.
Yes, yes. And so with organizing a space, and not really with organizing, but we're releasing something. So if a loved one passes away or dies,
Mm-hmm.
and we how do you help us to understand how to use our brain as it relates to releasing things that we're consumers
Mm-hmm.
more than any other, generation in the past. We consume more, not just things. We are consuming more information, letting go and releasing just to even be still
Yeah.
and learn who we are and how our brain works. It's hard for us to do that because we're constantly collecting and consuming.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you help us learn to release and to clear things out of our lives and our minds in order to really understand ourselves?
Sure. Well, we distract ourselves with things like shopping and material things so that we don't have to really sit still long enough to deal with whatever internal thoughts may pop up if we're not doing more things.
Right.
So many people get their dopamine ding from the purchasing of a new item, or the many. So I think it's important to understand that our internal experience in terms of our emotional state is created not by any objective reality. That amygdala, that part of our brain that creates our emotions, creates them based on what we tell ourselves or what we believe about a thing, how we interpret it. So it's really important to understand that we're thinking thousands of thoughts per day, and we need to evaluate what those thoughts are saying to us. So if we're saying something like, um, if I give this thing away, I may never be able to find something like it again. Or if I give this away, it means that I'm betraying my loved one. Or if I don't hold on to this thing, I'm not honoring their memory. Those thought processes can be challenged, right? If they were theoretically talking to a therapist or someone who was skilled in this area, they could help them dissect those thoughts and recognize that there's healthier ways to honor their loved ones. There's more effective ways of, start a nonprofit, do
Right.
something in your loved one's honor that helps keep, there's a number of ways to be able to, or even very simply, for some people, create a memorial in their home, pick your top pieces and
Yeah.
keep those in a display that helps you to honor that person. And then learning to, memorialize them in that way. There's lots of healthy ways to do those things. But that's not how the brain thinks, right? The brain is really trapped inside of what do I tell myself about this situation? And then I will create the anxiety, the stress, the depression, the guilt, the punishment, and all manner of emotional thought processes that go along with me telling myself that because Susie got this thing from China in her travels and now she's no longer present, I have to keep 15 of these because that's that's what will help me honor her, right?
Yes. Yes.
Then if I get rid of those, then I can psychologically spank myself and beat myself for being disloyal or whatever else. And again, this is how our biology creates our emotions. And most of the fantasies about what we tell ourselves take us on a very unnecessary roller coaster when it comes to our lives. But if you've never been taught you have an amygdala, how can you even know that that's what it's doing? Right?
Exactly.
So it's being able to recognize that our emotions dictate a lot of what we choose to do about things. And it's really important to listen to your emotions, but it's also important to understand that the way we tell our story and what we tell ourselves about something is directly related to how we will experience it in this invisible internal sensations and urges and surges that we call feelings, right? Like, our heart beats faster sometimes, our shoulders tense up, our
Yeah.
jaw clenches, right? These are all physical expressions of our emotions, but they are being manufactured by these parts of our brain.
So let's talk a bit about mirror neurons. I want to just understand that a little more because as I listened to your podcast and finished the six primitive, what's the name of the course? Six primitive
Yes.
brain systems.
Yes, on the Trauma Recovery Academy, we have a free mini crash course called the Primitive Brain Systems. And those primitive brain systems are the six primitive brain systems that are predictably programmed by any psychological trauma. It is the reticular activating system, amygdala, somatosensory cortex, brain reward system, biochemical matrix, and mirror neurons. Now, most people, they hear all those terms and they go, oh my gosh, it's going to be confusing. And I make it super simple.
You do.
So you, I really try to break it down in a way that makes sense to anyone. And those mirror neurons are located in various different parts of our brain, but different parts of our brain have different roles, right? The sides of our brain help us process language and through things that come in through our ears. The back of our brain processes what comes in through our eyes and what we're seeing, and so on and so forth. And so we have these things called mirror neurons that are specifically designed to absorb information from our environment and help us um, give back to our environment what it gives to us, right? This is one of the ways that humans absorb the sayings, the customs, the slang, the language that we use to interpret things. So our mirror neurons are really powerfully programmed to mimic. It's the reason why, you see little kids and they do things, and as they see their parents doing stuff, they try to do it too. And they can't do it as well. They don't have as good of the muscle nerve control, but they're still acting out the behaviors and the sounds and the words that the parents use. This is why we know that kids do what we do, not what we say, even though
Right.
we desperately would like for them to do what we say and not what we do. Okay. But what our mirror neurons also help us do is to be able to use programmed responses to things. This is the reason why, like when you're watching a show on TV and you see somebody like run into something, you're like, oh my goodness, I felt that, right? your body is able to briefly recreate sensations and other things that because it allows us to see like, oh, that probably hurt, that probably felt that way. It helps us to have empathy for each other because our bodies naturally recreate and mimic our environment. Only problem with this, though, is that we soak up things from our highest role models, no matter if they're on good behavior or bad behavior, right? And often, even when we are under stress, we play out the programming that we've soaked up from our environment. So this is why, you may have grown up like, oh, I hate cigarettes. I hate the smell of it. I couldn't stand when my parents were doing that. And then years later, you're like, oh, but you're curious. Your friends are smoking. And then next thing you know, you're like, oh, wait a minute. I'm mimicking behaviors that I saw, right? I'm mimicking language and things that have been thrown around me. It's the same phenomenon that causes us to catch on to a song or a phrase or accent that someone's using, and you find yourself saying it or mimicking it or thinking about it. You're like, how does this happen? So again, once we understand those mirror neurons and how reflective we are of each other, then it comes down to the problem that we blame other people for how they make us feel and how they make us act. Because then we go, well, I'm doing this because you're doing that. And they go, well, I'm doing this because you're doing that. So then we are stuck in this perpetual cycle where no one is taking the responsibility to show their higher selves and really be like, you know what? I'm going to be the one who shapes the environment around me, not them shaping me as much.
Yeah.
So that's really where I would say about those mirror neurons. And of course, I talk more about it in my trauma cure program that will be coming up in March. If anybody is able to come, you will learn lots about your mirror neurons. I'm pulling out these 6 parts of your brain, but there's way more to your brain than this. But I'm really trying to narrow it down to what things you need to really understand to understand your mental health. Most of the time, we're all looking to find that middle ground.
Yeah.
When it comes to looking at, okay, I was miserable by the way that my parents did this, so I want to do it a different way. And then trying to find like what things help my family. Now, there probably will be, just like there were consequences to them being overly harsh on something, there are consequences to being underly attentive to something. It's less important to think about it as right or wrong and more important for us to think about what's effective. When my room is organized and things are where they're supposed to be, I feel better. And I would say the same thing for people who are going through trauma. Most people don't want to talk about things, but that trauma just gets cluttered up. You just throwing it in the closet, shoving it back in there. And eventually, anytime you try to peek that door open, you can't think about one thing because then it'll take you here, take you there, take you here, take you there. And you don't want to deal with any of that, but it's still there under the surface. It's making you more snappy, more snarky, or making you avoid people or avoid doing things that could be healthier. So trauma is really the same way. It gets cluttered in our life by all of these things that we haven't dealt with or things that we may not even have realized are still with us. That person that hurt us in that past relationship, like, I'm over that, right? You may be over that person, but you may not be over that experience, and it's affecting your real-time ability to have peace in your relationships. That's what I mean by decluttering your trauma, because if you're carrying those things and using it to think in extremes, that's going to make you feel in extremes, react in extremes. And unfortunately, many people are recreating their own traumatic experiences because they don't realize their brain is stuck looking for something. And when you put your attention and focus on something, guess what? That human brain is you're gonna find it.
So the reason this Art of Letting Go series started is really because I want to help people to focus again on purging, sorting, clearing, and releasing of their stuff in preparation for their end of life. It's hard for people to let go, and you just kind of explained why. What are your thoughts about us avoiding the topic of our end of life? We don't want to think about death, and we all know we're going to die. We don't want to think about decluttering in order to, you can make decluttering sound attractive by saying this helps your children or your whoever's going to inherit whatever you have.
Right.
Help them to think less about what to do with your things, help them to focus on grieving when you're no longer here because there's less to deal with. But
Yeah.
we don't want to think about death or dying. Dying isn't death. We don't, and if we can't deal with our primitive brain systems now, and there's an evolved brain system as well. So if we can't get to that place when
Yeah.
we're dying, it's more difficult to be in the moment. And there could be blessings in that experience. Your well-being is about your whole life, not just one aspect of your life. And it's also
Yeah.
how you're connected with other people. So, how do I help people to
Sure.
think about their brain as it relates to their end of life?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important we acknowledge that amygdala, it specializes in fear. It specializes in creating, the making things into extremes and reminding us of all the worst possible case scenarios.